I shared my screen and I lost my unmute button, so I just found it. But thank you so much for having me. Sam, I think we were doing the same thing last night, which was figuring out how to cut out pieces because the first run through and even are left sort of with the same format. So I will try to get through it as well. And obviously with the caveat, ask me questions afterwards, and then we can pick up on the other areas. And so my name is Kelley Packalen, and I'm an associate professor of strategy and organization in the Smith School of Business. And I wanted to talk to you, and I'm also using a new platform here. So let me, there we go. So this is a course that I've been teaching. It's COM 405, and I'll get into what that is in a moment. But I've been teaching this course basically since I arrived at Queen's in 2004. And this is the third sort of major overhaul that I had done just as times changed. And I won't get into the reasons for that in the interest of time. But I had already been planning before I went on sabbatical in 2019, 2020 to really fundamentally change this course when I came back to teaching in the fall of 2020. And you can see what the goals were there. But the reason I have a gift here, pictures of a gift at the bottom of this slide, is because as we transitioned to remote learning in the summer of 2020, we got this little announcement from the Commerce Office, and all it had was one sentence that basically said, you may want to consider breaking your class into smaller groups and meeting with each of those smaller groups once a week simultaneously. So the idea, maybe you can increase more engagement if you have a smaller group and you're not trying to lecture to a huge group. And this was like my gift of a lifetime, because, or at least my time here, because I've always wanted to do a seminar discussion-based course with my students, and you can't do that with a group of 55 to 60 students. And so I was like, yes, I get to do this. So I designed the course. And so the outcome is a small group. So what I did was I took my class and I broke it into groups of about 12 to 15 students. And then I added additional time. So that wasn't scheduled in Solus, where there were at least a group of 12 to 15 students who could meet at that time. So it involved some scheduling on the back end, figuring out what people's schedules were. And then I met with each of those groups once a week for a discussion-based entrepreneurship course that was really designed from the get-go to transition smoothly between remote and in-person education. And the discussion is really guided by this mix of EDII-aware pre-class preparation materials and then the questions that the students bring to class. And so I'm learning a lot of things today. For those of you who were in the earlier session, I learned that I have been doing ungrading for years and didn't know it was called that. And so this is something that I think is really has elements of the flipped classroom, but I've never really used that terminology or read the pedagogy on that terminology. Just because if you're like me, you like some reference. So I thought I'd go through, these are the course topics. Getting started, this is what's covered in a lot of entrepreneurship courses, but not just, I look at it from a little bit of a different angle. The power of imprinting really builds on sort of my passion areas and my research going back to my graduate days, and is really the piece that's different and new for the students. And that's the part that they really kind of latch on to the most. And then we follow it up with some sort of considerations of growth. And each semester, the students, I've taught this now 4 semesters in this revised format. Each semester, the students choose through a process of kind of selecting and then voting on those topics that they suggested, 2 topics. So it changes, those last 2 weeks change every single semester based on what the students want. So before the course even began, there's a bunch of things that I did to lay the groundwork, and I want to talk about these just very, very briefly. First was my aha moment. So I mentioned being on sabbatical. So I was on sabbatical at Aalto University in Finland, 2019, 2020. And there I was introduced to 2 things. One was workload. So this idea of in all of your syllabi, when you teach there, you have to put your expectations, how many hours in class, how many hours of homework assignments, how many hours, and it has to equal a certain number, and you have to pull things out if it's going to exceed that. So I really took that to heart, and I started to adjust my syllabi and pull elements out, reduce the number of readings if I was exceeding this idea of 9 hours per week. So they were in the classroom for 1.5, and then it's 7.5 hours on average outside. And then I created assignments that were really around, and again, this is coming from, you'll hear echoes. So for those of you who are here earlier, some of this has come from my conversations with Kate. Christine Kolche is another person in the School of Business who I've talked to a lot about assignments, but also again from Finland, where they talk about learning diaries. So really about fundamental skill development, universal design. And then just quickly on the customization piece, this is a course that is a required course, the last of a series of required course for engineering students who are in an innovation stream. It's an upper year elective for commerce students, and it's popular among exchange students. And these students who come in, this may be like the last of every possible entrepreneurship class they could have taken in the school, or it may have been the first that they've taken. So there's a huge diverse student body. And then the last piece is really building flexibility and accountability into the course policies, just around sort of lateness, late assignments, when to flexibility, et cetera. And I won't touch on that now much. And the second was, well, what readings do I choose? And first you'll see readings that are in quotation, because it wasn't just written text. I used popular press, articles, journal articles, teaching them how to introduce to read an academic article, podcasts, TED Talks, reports, and always trying to find resources where the same content would be in multiple formats. The second piece is one of my mantras for the course, and you may be the same when I say the word entrepreneur. For most, not most people, but for a lot of people and a lot of the students in the class, they think Elon Musk, they think Steve Jobs, they think Mark Zuckerberg. And so one of my mantras in this class is that there is no one type of entrepreneur, and there's no one right way to be an entrepreneur. So my readings had to reflect that. If that's what I was saying to them, they had to be exposed to a number of different stories and approaches. And then the third piece was about being freely available. And this has actually turned out to be one of the most challenging, because there were some great articles that were behind a paywall and that weren't available through the library. And so I just had to say no to them, even though they were incredible, because I had set this bar that said everything has to be freely available for the students. And then the third thing I did even before the course started was I had a pretty detailed survey, much more beyond sort of what you were expecting, catered when we were remote, questions about remote when we came back, transitioning to coming back. And then I had students fill out that survey, and I met with every single student. I think I had like a 98% rate. There was maybe one or two that I couldn't catch. And I met with them individually to understand their exposure to entrepreneurship courses, why they were taking the course, to kind of educate them a little bit on this unique format, speak to how they could customize the different assignments to their individual learning goals, to understand that. And also really explain to them about like my philosophy of skill development. And so this was about communication. And so that this is a skill that takes practice. And so I pull it back to if they played sports, to sports, if they played a musical instrument, to say like, you may not get a great grade the first week. This is not a course that's an easy A, but it's not an impossible A. And we'll be with you along the way to give you that feedback. And so really kind of stressing that piece. In the classroom, this piece is fast. So this is probably maybe sometime a little bit more familiar with some in this audience. And so how did I do this discussion? I used more complicated technology. I've come back to Google Docs. It's simple, and sometimes the lower tech is the better. Students would submit those questions at the start of the class. And then I would have them again to build that community, which was particularly important when we were remote. I would put them into sort of random breakout groups. I'd always check to make sure there wasn't a single female in the group. So kind of thinking about that inclusion and that sort of thing. And said, like, discuss one of the questions, but you can also talk about what you did on the weekend, because I wanted to include that base of familiarity and sort of comfort level with one another. And then we would just work our way through the questions, and I would continually remind students that there was no one right answer. And so often I would actually give them readings that had differing points of view to reinforce that there wasn't one story. And then I had to be willing to step in with mini lectures, improvised activities, analogies if students don't have the answers. So I'm going to go to sort of some reflections now. Lauren, how am I doing with time? A couple minutes still?
Yeah, a couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay, so students were generally appreciative, and this, I won't read these, but really like they enjoyed hearing the different viewpoints. They really loved the small groups and the discussions. They wished they had more of this. You know, for many, it was their first experience at doing that. The reflection pieces, this particular student wrote, but some did podcasts, some did PowerPoints. They really liked that ability to kind of go back. One said they'd take the course again if they could, which I thought was kind of fun. But there were, just like Sam said, there were some unexpected, some anticipated challenges, but some unexpected. One is this puts a lot of onus on the students. And so regardless of, there was a lot going on. And so if no one comes to your class prepared and you have a 90-minute session that's meant to be discussion and no one's prepared, you have to be prepared to switch to almost like a mini lecture based on those few questions and kind of carry it. And so I did more talking over the years, and over the times that I've done it, and I've become more comfortable with that's okay in terms of having to switch back and forth. So I couldn't have done this as a novice to the subject matter, because it does require kind of pulling on the fly and like, okay, let's do an exercise here, and figuring out on the fly what exercise we could possibly do. I also learned that not all readings lead themselves to focused discussions, because there usually is, as much as I want the students to bring their questions, there usually is a key piece of learning that I want them to take, or a key piece of reflection topic, at least, that I want them to focus on. And so I was changing out readings to keep them current to the topics. And I've actually gone back and put in some older readings because they were more focused on what I really wanted them to be discussing that day. Not all questions are good questions. This is something I've actually used a similar format for my MSc and PhD program, and we actually, seminar that I teach, and there I actually sit with them and we break down their questions and we say, like, why is this? Like, why does this lead to discussion? Why does this kind of shut some people out? And we break that down. I need to be better about doing that with the undergrad. And then when you put these flexible, like drop your lowest 3, what I had happened was my most engaged students were actually checking out for the last quarter of the semester, because they had been really good about doing their assignments every week. And they're like, okay, I've done my 9 of 12 and now I'm done. And I'm just going to focus on other work. And so I've actually changed subtle ways of the wording around that. And then I won't go into these, but aha moments. And so this is a communication course. And so I've learned that. So we've really reflected and changed the wording around that, really about practicing the skill, and we've become much more emphasized. Exposure is powerful. And so I put in some readings that were really kind of pushing the boundary on sort of diversity. And I didn't know how students would react to them. And they didn't come up in the conversations and the daily conversation. I was like, oh, maybe they didn't. But in their final projects, those are the pieces that they're coming back to. So they actually are dwelling on it, and it's taking a while. So that really just encourages me to even put more, and I can talk about what some of those examples were. And finally, I will say it, I miss aspects of Zoom. There were some aspects of Zoom, and one of them was that, right now, I mean, we're more than, but like when I had a small group, everyone was on the screen and I wasn't at the front of the classroom. So that power differential disappeared in Zoom. That was more apparent elsewhere. I loved the integration of the polls because I want to minimize the kind of switching between technology, and I can do a very quick, like, how's everyone feeling? Oh, that's a great point. Let me put together a quick poll. I found some workarounds to that. And then also having that chat to augment those who are maybe wanting to participate in a different way that's harder to do in a classroom. So a little over, but I am done, Lauren. So thank you very much, everyone. And I look forward to questions that people may have.